Assalamu alaikum and welcome. Over this series of episodes, we've been talking about the importance of seeking justice, understanding what justice is and recognizing injustices in our societies, in our communities. But also how we can communicate with each other, how we can understand our situations better, how we can perhaps address each other in ways that allow us to unite rather than create further divisions. And I've spoken one episode about the use of artistic forms of expression that can sometimes overcome our differences and speak to the heart. And over the more recent episodes, I've been addressing what it is about ourselves as individuals in a spiritual sense that can help us to gain the benefit of this world for the akhirah, and which could also prevent us from reaching the blessings through the forms of disease and sickness of the heart. And therefore I've been looking at the text of Imam Maulud's poem, Purification of the Heart. And poetry in itself is a way to explore things in many layers, in reaching people's hearts and understanding. And the commentary in English by Sheikh Hamza Yusuf is very interesting and useful. So I'm going over these different topics. And today I wanted to talk about something that is related to ostentation. Ostentation, we've already discussed about trying to do things not for the sake of Allah, but for the sake of other people or for the sake of the admiration of other people and related motivations, so that our motivation becomes something not about purifying ourselves or purifying our deen or helping each other. It becomes about gain, material gain or status that is built on the back of other people and that is built on reliance other than Allah. And one of the huge central cause of all of this is that reliance on Allah. If we have that reliance, if we have that trust, if we have that patience, if we have that amount of taqwa and iman, then we can really achieve things. And they might not be achievements that we necessarily, from a material perspective, consider to be achievements, but they are certainly achievements that will help us in the akhirah rather than the dunya. So when we're talking about injustice, we accept that everything, is willed by Allah, but that it is our duty to speak out against oppressors, that it is our duty to help one another and to love that for our brothers and sisters that we love for ourselves. So what about this other disease of the heart that is so intrinsically linked to ostentation and absolutely causes so many of the oppressive actions and oppressive environments that we create for ourselves? And the Imam explores this at great length, and that is seeking reputation, seeking the building of good reputation. That is making people admire us, hoping that our reputation will bring us a sense of self-satisfaction, but also the attentions of others, that we'll get wealth from it, that we'll get status. And it's a dangerous disease of the heart because, for starters, most of us have the ability to possess it. It's something, we treasure our reputations. We don't want to be seen as bad. And that relates in some cases to pleasing people. We want to please our parents. We want to please our loved ones by seeming to be, the good people that we hope to be. So reputation is important to us. But by seeking it outside the boundaries of what is acceptable, by seeking it in a way that draws us away from God, this can be very dangerous. And there is the hadith of the Prophet ﷺ that the Imam tells us about the person seeking reputation, that his reality will be revealed on Judgment Day, that God knows the underlying reality of that person, and that as far as we are concerned, building reputation, showing it off, being concerned about it, can actually betray us, and it can be part of actually decreasing our reputation with God as we increase it in the dunya, as we increase it with people who may or may not be beneficial to us at all. And the Imam also explores a verse of the Quran in chapter 3, verse 26, which in English has a meaning of, you exalt whomever you will, and you debase whomever you will. With your will is all good. You have power over all things. So this exaltation of God, that actually it is in the power of God, not in ours. And our reputation should be the focus of worship, that we need to recalibrate that whole concept, the motivation and intention, not about making ourselves seem big enough for our own egos and for the others, but for the good of the deen, for the good of our akhirah. And what's tricky about this, and especially when we've been talking about social justice and the way that we need to bring each other together, that we need to unite and inspire each other to help and support each other, one of the trappings of this is that we try often to help one another by saying, well, look, this is what I've been doing, why don't you help? Or, oh, well, that's what this person's been doing, but I think we can do it better this way. So in some ways, having a good reputation and trying to use that reputation for the benefit of others can be something positive. But at the same time, there's a double-edged sword there. If we focus on trying to show other people what we've been doing, we can often get into that trap of trying to either increase our reputation or fall into that trap that we've spoken previously about, which is ostentation and trying to show that off, which again, it doesn't have the positive effect that we might hope to, but actually undermines what it is that we're doing. And this relates to the hadith that the Prophet ﷺ said in meaning, whoever displays his good deeds, his deeds will be revealed on the Day of Judgment. So again, this idea that the ultimate judgment on all of these things is with God, not with ourselves, and therefore that is the focus that we should have, rather than focusing on the things that distract us from the point. So not that we could use our good actions to benefit each other, but that we don't get the focus wrong, that we don't end up focusing on those actions, but think of them as a means to a better end, and the important end, and the end that we all should be keeping in mind. And within the text, the Imam tells us a story, and it's a very beautiful story, and I'd like to recount it. He talks about the spiritual sage Abu al-Abbas al-Mursi, who related that he was once in the marketplace. And he saw a man, a very righteous man that he knew, and a man who was known for both scholarship and spirituality, so someone that people went for advice, for teaching. But this man was also a merchant. And Al-Mursi, as he tells us, thought to himself that if he were going to go to this righteous person, he could also purchase his goods for a better price, because he knew this person was very humble, was God-fearing, and therefore would be unlikely to be ripping anybody off or charging prices that were excessive. But Al-Mursi then, after this thought, felt a voice admonishing him. His own conscience was calling. Make your religion sound and do not desire benefit from created beings. So again, this idea that we don't just gain from people, we gain from Allah, and that is the source of goodness. And so the Imam again quotes the Quran, in this case chapter 6 verse 17, which in English means, and if God were to touch you with affliction, there is none who can relieve it save him. And if God were to touch you with a good fortune, then know he is powerful over all things. So again, always remembering that whatever it is, good or bad, is coming from God. So understanding about the power of God over our lives then again reminds us of the role of the oppressors, and in particular those who have hatred in their hearts towards other people, who have hatreds in their hearts to other people in groups or as individuals, are always doomed to fail. So we're told, other than praying against the oppressor, the prayer of the wrongdoer in fact comes back towards us. So if we have those negative prayers, if we hold hatred and try and pray that those false hatreds come true, then they are in fact endangering ourselves, not those who we hope to afflict. But that we are aware that the prayers of the oppressed are the ones that are held most dear, that those are listened to. And for the oppressors, that is something to remember. That is something that is very powerful. For those who have no power, the power of dua is far stronger than those that the oppressors may wield over them, whether that's physical violence or different social pressures or different political powers. Ultimately, the goodness that comes from those with good intention and the experience of those who are oppressed outweighs the power of those who wield hatred and wield difficulties against other people for their own desires and for their own gain. So the heedlessness of the oppressors, the heedlessness of those who forget the grand scale of things, the big picture, the fact that we are slaves of Allah, this can also manifest itself on a day-to-day basis. And the Shayukh are very clear in also reminding us that we can be heedless in small ways. When we're sick, for example, it's very easy for us to start praying, to say, oh, please, save me, make me better, or make those of us who we love better. But as soon as the sickness subsides, it's easy to forget again. The need goes away, the immediate sense of need goes away. Or we praise the medication, but we forget to praise Allah. And that kind of heedlessness as well manifests itself in different ways. And we can find ourselves, slipping away and these little bits that chip away at the purity of our hearts. And if we let them take us down a path that can be very damaging to ourselves and others around us. So how might we challenge this within ourselves? How might we challenge this idea that we need to rely on God and not seek reputation, not try and bolster ourselves in order to somehow gain worldly things or out of fear of people thinking badly about us? Because sometimes it's that fear about people thinking badly of us that leads us into oppressive acts. Well, the Imam is very clear again in that we should remember qualities of God and the idea of sustenance, al-razik, the sustainer, those who bring the one who brings rizq, the one who is able to provide for us without us worrying about it. If we rely on God in that way, we can understand that sustenance comes from Him, and that no matter how much we covet things or how much we show off or how many worldly gains we desire, ultimately it is the sustenance that comes from God that we have, whether or not that is withheld at times or whether that's given in abundance, and that we must be happy with that, and again not envy each other. So all of these diseases of the heart keep connecting back, keep connecting to our internal state, our spiritual state, and how we connect with God, how we connect with each other, because they're intimately linked. And the way that we behave with each other as a way of expressing the deen, of expressing the obligations of committing good deeds over bad deeds, and these all link back and tie in with the broader questions of how we treat people, how we treat those who we have power over, how we treat those who might have difficulties in this life, whether it's those who are facing poverty and deprivation, whether it's those who are considered less able, people with physical disabilities or mental illness, or even those people who we just feel an unwitting hatred for or dislike, those who look different or behave in different ways, or who make us feel fearful, not because of their own actions, but because of insecurities that we have. So really how we look at ourselves and reflect, and also the fact that we're not stuck in these states, we can transform. The heart can harden, and we have to be aware that the hardened heart is very difficult to get through. But while we're aware, trying to work on it and try and think, what is it about me that's making me behave in these ways? And making the people around me, why is this conflict happening in this location? Can we somehow heal the spiritual wounds that will help to heal the physical, political and social wounds? So I'll continue this analysis of the text after the break, inshallah, and please join me then. Assalamu alaikum. Assalamu alaikum and welcome back. Before the break, we were discussing the different attributes, negative attributes that seeking reputation brings. And that connects to the kind of oppressive acts that we find amongst us, in our own selves and within the conflicts we find in our communities. And looking further into Imam Maulud's poem and the commentary about it, we see other diseases of the heart that connect very closely to this, and also explain the kind of reasons why it is that we end up being in situations that do not befit us and acting in ways that oppress other people. And one of the actions that we often find ourselves drawn into is that of fraud. Now, fraud, when we think of it in a criminal sense, is something that we have spoken about as well. If we have a look at the food fraud, the idea that for economic gain, people can sell one kind of meat as another kind of meat, that kind of criminal fraud. Within the Islamic tradition, the idea that someone could dress up a product as better than it is. So the example of making camels look healthier than they are, of covering up mange on a coat in order to get a better price for our goods. Again, this is seen as something fraudulent and absolutely contrary to the way of God. And again, why are we doing these forms of fraud? Is it because we have to, or is it because we are looking for economic gain or social gain, and we wish to present things in ways that are better than they really are? And this also works for the tongue. Sheikh Hamza Yusuf talks within the text about how the sophists of Greece, for example, introduced the idea of relativity into morality. So the idea that if we could persuade people through the beautiful speaking or persuasive argument and rhetoric, that it itself defined goodness. So being right wasn't about a particular moral framework, it was about persuading the audience. And if you can persuade people that somehow this was the right way. Now, of course, this is a completely different perspective from that of the Muslims, where there are very clear paths of righteousness and paths that lead us in directions which are dangerous for us both in the dunya and the akhirah. So this idea of fraud is not only damaging to the people which we do it to, but it also damages us. And the Imam is extremely vigilant in showing us why fraud is connected to as a disease of the heart, but also to these different manifestations of evil. A further example explored within the text is that of vanity. And again, where does vanity get us? It's something extremely common. It's something very strongly found within all of us in human nature, and some of us more than others. But vanity doesn't only act as a false reflection of our own selves, but it can be very damaging because we start doing things to feed our own vanity, to feed what pleases us about ourselves, and can actually inflict harm on others. So within the text, Imam al-Ghazali is quoted, for example. He used to define arrogance as something that required two people. Because the arrogant one had to show his arrogance by inflicting his bad manners and ugly self upon that other person. So to be arrogant, you need someone else to be arrogant towards. Vanity, on the other hand, it is argued, doesn't require anyone else. It just requires ourselves and a pleasure to ourselves, whether that's being admiring of ourselves in the mirror, a simple act of vanity that most of us suffer on a daily basis in some way, or perhaps the insecurities rather than vanity that come from this obsession with the self, but also the plumping of the ego in trying to as well gain the worldly things, in seeing ourselves as better than we are, in trying to pursue those things that we feel beautify us as part of that pursuit of vanity, which in fact pull the wool over our eyes and pull the carpet from under our feet, to use these expressions. That is to trick us into feeling a false sense of security about our status in the world and also our status with God. Religiousness in itself can be a trap. We can feel that our good deeds that our good behaviour is somehow very becoming of us, and that we are achieving religiosity, that we are achieving piety. And in fact, is it an exercise in pleasing God? Is the direction about becoming better in the deen, or is it about us pleasing ourselves? And if it's about pleasing ourselves, this again links to these other diseases of the heart, where we start pursuing things that are not only damaging to us, but damaging to the people around us, our families, our communities, and more broadly, social relations at the macro level. And again, the Imam reminds us, if we think of God more than ourselves, we'll be much more safe. So, for example, we might practice a skill, we might practice a sport or an art that we become very good at, that we excel in. And we feel a sense of pride, but that sense of achievement and sense of pride, if we think about it as just emanating from ourselves, if we think about this as feeding our vanity, again, we're losing track of the reality, we're losing track of the fact that that skill, that gift, that achievement didn't really come from us. Again, it is a gift. It is a gift from Allah, and one that can be taken away again. And if we remind ourselves of that, that vanity and that pursuit of the dunya disappears or is able to dissipate, or we can keep it under control and keep reminding ourselves. So again, the Shaykh try and keep reminding us of what it is that we may be able to achieve if we keep our eye on the ultimate goal. And that can really transform the way we interact with the world, transform the way that we even see ourselves, for the benefit of the individual and the benefit of the people. And this, of course, relates to the quote of the Quran in chapter 12, verse 76, which in English can be rendered, "Above all those who have knowledge is the all-knowing," that is God. So we may be pleased with ourselves, we may learn and like to show off what we know, but if we remember that in reality these pieces of knowledge come from God, and of course God is the all-knower, is the all-seeing, again it keeps our ego in check. We know that we are in fact fairly insignificant, small individuals in a cosmos that we know very little about. And as people, we are one in billions and billions over the history of mankind. And that can help check the way that we see ourselves and our relationship to other people, and of course to our Creator. Sheikh Hamza Yusuf reminds us of some of the etymology of all these words, so that vanity itself comes from the Latin venus, which means empty. And again, the words themselves can remind us of the reality of these feelings, that being vain is ultimately very superficial. It doesn't actually mean that much. And we are told about an example of a Roman Empire who was victorious, who had won battles and who was being celebrated in the streets, but who had employed a slave to whisper in his ears that all this is vanity, all this really results in nothing. And that ancient civilization, the ones who had conquered so much, while successful, were also reminding themselves that these so-called achievements in the dunya were not necessarily going to last. And we see this many examples, those who have been praised within our media but soon taken down again. People's fall from grace. We see politicians who are lauded and celebrated, but the veneer of respectability or the veneer of the love of the people can easily crumble. We're all human and we do things that are not so good as well as those that are good. And so when we become vain, or we put people on pedestals and feed their vanity, very quickly we can crumble away, and the reality of humanity, the reality of all of our states, that we are inclined towards bad as well as towards good, becomes very clear. So the challenge to vanity is often related to the phrase, pride comes before a fall. And often vanity itself is crushed by humility and things being taken away from us. And that's always something to remember, that what we have and what we feel plumped up about can also be our downfall, or in fact dissipate very quickly and easily when we forget that these things are temporary, this world is temporary, and that it all does ultimately come from God. So what can the text tell us about? What is all this about? Yes, it's about purifying the heart. It's about making us better and stronger spiritual beings. But it also, of course, connects to the things that we bring to the world. If we can conquer vanity, if we can conquer our desire to be loved, if we can conquer our obsession with reputation, if we can conquer this idea that being fraudulent by taking shortcuts, by trying to fool the people around us, that we can gain, all of these things not only contribute to forms of injustice and oppression, but actually debase us as human beings. But they are things that we can overcome. And by focusing on the spiritual, by doing these things such as fasting, such as remembering God, such as remembering death, and the way that we will become absolutely judged and responsible for our activities, we can transform ourselves. So simple, everyday spiritual elements that connect to the broader conversations within the dunya and of course the akhirah. So I hope this has been useful. This text is absolutely useful to me. I'm not an Islamic scholar, I'm someone who's learning as well, but I'm interested as a sociologist how the spiritual is so central to the social. It is central to the way that we understand the world, because as opposed to the secular framework, the Islamic framework centers the relationship between people and God as a focus for the dunya, as a focus for our social relations, so that that is central and that is what leads and guides us, rather than going with the whims of humanity, going with the different fashions, the different norms, the different cultures that we find ourselves amongst. So inshallah, join me next time, and thank you for listening. Assalamu alaikum.